It says that we are live on YouTube. So
Mhm.
welcome to all the people on YouTube. And then um, I know that the link has been posted through Facebook. So hopefully people will be able to find it through one of those means and then they can join in. So yeah, we're going to get started in a few minutes here. Please feel free to comment, share your thoughts, share any, ask any questions. Um, yeah, we'd love to hear what you have to say. So thanks for taking the time to join us. For those of you who don't know me, which I'd be very surprised because I'm pretty sure it's only been on my social media. So yeah, so my name's Avery, and this is my good friend Jean-Luc. Um, Jean-Luc, do you want to give us a little 20-second bio of yourself so that people know who you are and what you care about and why we're having this conversation and why you're a good person to talk about these topics with?
Well, I don't know if there's enough about me to fill 20 seconds, but no. Okay, sure. So, like Avery says, my name's Jean-Luc. I'm just now wrapping up a master's in marriage and family therapy at a Protestant school, actually. So I've been forced to really think about how mental health fits into living out the spiritual life. And kind of in opposition to or in tension with some sort of opposing theological ideas. I think that gives me a unique perspective on how to approach mental health and the spiritual life and theology, because I've been forced to deal with this not only um, with Protestants, but then like trying to fit this all together on my own. So,
Right, right.
mhm.
And you're Roman Catholic, just so people
Yeah,
know your
yes, I'm
background.
I'm
Yeah.
Roman Catholic, yes, Latin
Mm,
Catholic, Latin Catholic Avery, technical
right.
term.
Okay. My apologies. There you go. So Latin Rite Catholicism. Yeah. So something that's emerged in my own, private conversations with Jean-Luc has just been this really strong connection between, um, yeah, all dimensions of the human person, especially the psychological, mental, and the spiritual. So that's going to be kind of the main topic that we're going to be exploring. So I just want to give it maybe a minute or two more, see if people join on. If not, that's okay. But yeah, you're in Vancouver right now.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Is it rain? Is it raining there?
Um, it's cloudy right now, but the weather said there's like a 99% chance of rain today or something like that. So it should be raining shortly.
Okay. Yeah. See, I'm in Winnipeg right now, and it's a good minus. It's probably kind of warm for December. It's like minus 12. We got snow on the ground, but I over a lot of rain and like 4 degrees. I don't know. I think I would take the cold and the snow.
Oh, I love the rain. I'll take the rain every time.
I don't know. Maybe people feel differently. Anyway, well, we'll get started with our conversation here then. Um, oh, there we go. Oh, we got Dr. Wallenfang joining us here, and it looks like they're having some issues with things freezing. So I'm going to just quickly close a few of my other tabs just to see if that makes a difference in the video feed. Hopefully other people are not experiencing a lag because lag is not fun. Yeah, Jean-Luc, your connection's been pretty good so far as I can tell. So
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but it can be really inconsistent sometimes, so I might suddenly drop. We'll see. But yeah.
the challenges of not doing this, in a professional studio with proper Ethernet cables and all those good things that professionals can afford.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Also, a good gentle rebuke for me to not have so many tabs open on my device here.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Not 20 of them at once.
somewhere in the neighborhood of 50, it looks like.
Okay.
So that might be why this is slowing down. But anyway, um,
Yeah,
yeah.
that would
So
actually make a
again,
difference.
mhm. Yeah. So again, welcome to everyone who's joining us. Anyone who's watching the live stream, anyone who is watching the recorded video. Thank you for taking the time to check this out, even if only briefly. I hope that we can say something that is worth your time, and I hope you'll find this conversation interesting. yeah, as I said before, please feel free to comment and share your thoughts. And I think that'll be a really great way for us to turn this not so much into a monologue or even just a dialogue, but a real conversation with, yeah, with lots of people and different ideas bouncing around, because those are more fun, I think. So, wow, there are so many tabs I'm so closing. That's okay. All right.
Yeah,
Canadian weather is
out of the darkness.
Oh, I now understand. Dr. Wallen Fang said the Canadian weather is freezing. Well, I guess I closed a
Okay.
whole bunch of tabs on my computer for nothing. That's fine. I'm not upset about
I don't know about for nothing.
that.
There's probably some benefit in not having 50 tabs open, if only
True.
psychologically.
Right, right. Yeah, so our main topic here, so I guess we can just kind of preface it with this. So Jean-Luc, you mentioned at the start that you are have just kind of finished all your coursework for your master's in marriage and family counseling. So we were just talking before we came on the live stream here. You don't actually have the piece of paper in your hand yet. That's what you're waiting
No,
for.
I don't. I don't.
But you are most of the way there. So I guess, yeah, if you could maybe share a little bit about your experience and what brought you into the field.
Sure. So during my undergrad, I sort of already felt a calling to counseling field, just because it seemed to fit with a lot of my gifts, and was something that someone with my disposition would really thrive in, which is like a one-on-one, intimate setting where I can talk about deep things with people and help them. Which that could have many different forms, but counseling was definitely one that was sticking out to me at the time. So 3 years ago, I decided to take the leap and to return back up here to Canada to do my master's in the field. So yeah, it's been something that's required a bit of discernment, but I've been very solid once I made the decision, because it seems like God was very clear to me that this is what He wanted me to do. And so here I am, a few years later, at the tail end of it. Now starting to look into employment in the field. So.
Right. Yes, and having been beside you in that journey, I know that it's been a lot of work and a lot of time invested. So
A lot of stress.
yes. Yeah. So okay. Well, yeah. I think that's a great starting point, and I guess as a means of a segue, I remember a couple of years ago speaking to atheists in different groups. People that didn't share Christian faith, and sometimes the argument would be put forward that, and I mean, I don't think most atheists hold this argument because I don't think it's a very good argument, but nevertheless, sometimes the argument would be brought forward that Christians, because there's a contradiction between science and the Bible. That Christians, they have faith, so why should they have access to medicine? Again, I don't think most atheists hold this argument, very few probably. But the point really is, and I think there is something more fundamental there, is that sometimes there can be these dividing lines put between spiritual health and physical health and mental health. And so I guess for you, where do you maybe see some of the tension points with that in your own studies? And where do you see some of the points that maybe there's been a really healthy overlap between the two?
Sure. So I think the starting point for me is that God created us as a unity, right? Where we need both body and soul to really actually be fully human. So even when you think about heaven, that heaven as it is now, as a disembodied state, is still an unnatural state for us, as blissful as God makes it. So we always have to keep in mind that there aren't going to be any intrinsic contradictions between the different parts of ourselves, because they're all necessary for us to have health and well-being, and even to grow spiritually, right? So if your body is ailing, if you're not taking good care of it, that can mess with your psychological, mental functioning and your emotional balance, and that in turn will throw off your spiritual balance, right? Same thing spiritually. If you're in this deep sense of desolation, that's actually leading you into depression, which are different things, but it can lead you there into depression and feeling down, and that slows you down emotionally and then physically as well, right? So all these things, they're all connected, and so one affects the other, and so it's really hard to draw a neat line between them. As a matter of necessity in the sciences, we have to draw some lines for sure. But the fact is, like, those lines are blurred. And so any theologian is going to run into issues with the philosopher, is going to run into things with the psychologist, with the physicist, right? We all have to interact with each other, and respect it. Like, there's an element where we have to respect each other's fields, but also that we have lots of different things to say about the same subject.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a great point. I don't know if that's the most popular or widely held opinion right now.
No, because these days, like, part of the sciences too being so compartmentalized, and all of the sciences compartmentalized, even the higher ones, is that it's easy to draw these false dichotomies, right, between at the biggest level then science and faith, which I think is kind of what you're touching on, right? Or the physical and the mental and the spiritual. It's easy to compartmentalize these, but they by necessity interact with each other, and they overlap with each other.
Right.
And this, I think, it even speaks to how we're made in the image of God, where God has put a part of himself, where he's created this reflection of himself in physical reality. And the spiritual world, all of that can exist as one thing, one substance. But when it comes to us as a finite creature with physical bodies, it means that all of those aspects have to be divided across different layers of the human person.
Right.
But they ultimately reflect God's divine image. And so by necessity, they can't contradict until sin throws them a bit out of alignment. Which is sort of how I see it, is that sin throws things out of alignment, but it doesn't destroy the unity. It's kind of like it just, like you're back at a place.
Sure. I'll just pick up from what you mentioned there. So there's a lot of things that you just covered, but I think this theological concept of sin is an interesting one. It's not a popular topic to preach about, obviously. If you go to most especially Catholic churches and Protestant churches, they are not going to emphasize that. And I mean, that's not the whole point of Christianity, right? Like, sin is the garbage to get rid of. It's not the primary focus. But I do think that it's, maybe you can elaborate on this. But given this kind of unity, this picture you're painting of, God has made us as one, and so there is no contradiction between the deepest truths of who we are. Given this unity, things that are sinful, so theologically we understand them as wrong and evil. There's also a psychological effect to all of these as well that can be very negative. Even physical effects, right? If you think of something like, taking drugs, obviously there's some very damaging physical effects. But maybe, if you want to nuance that a little bit more, what do you see as maybe the connection between something that has a negative spiritual reality and how that might correspond to something that's psychologically damaging?
Could you flesh that a little bit more? I feel like you asked a lot there, so if you could distill it just a little bit more for me.
Sure, yeah. So to make it simple, do you see a connection between sin and things that could potentially harm someone's mental health?
Okay. Yes. So more broadly speaking, of course, sin throws all of the universe out of a sort of natural harmony and unity too. And so as a counselor, at least when I'm thinking about sin, I am thinking more about the woundedness part, not so much the moral part. Right. So sin has, and we don't talk about these two things together a whole lot, but on the one hand, sin is this offense against reason and this break of the relationship, or damaging to the relationship with God, right? And from that flows consequences that include deep woundedness, even down to even at the most basic existential for us as human beings, right? Which is that yes, the disconnection from God, but also sort of disconnection within ourselves. What was the second part of your question? How does that interplay with
sin? Yeah, sin and mental health, as it were.
Yes. So then the mental health aspect would be just that part, another part of ourselves that's thrown out of alignment, but it is also wounded, right? And that needs healing. It's not. It hasn't just been. It's like being punched and something's knocked out of alignment, and then it also scars your skin, or hurts an organ or something.
Hmm.
And so the counselor's there to handle that wounded part that then makes it more difficult to go about your life in other ways, right? If your leg's broken, you can't walk.
Hmm.
Um, and so counselors do that on a mental and particularly emotional and social level, actually.
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, yeah, I like that analogy a lot, that a single wound or single damaging incident can have effects on multiple levels of our person, right? And we just understand that from knowing the natural sciences and biology. And it's funny, my own background is in kinesiology. That was my undergraduate, so I have some grasp of these things, although that was a while ago. But
Yes.
but of course, I mean, something as, seemingly simple as your knee joint, like there's just so much, in terms of the complexity. So if, you were to sustain serious trauma to your knee, it's not just, oh, you might break the bone. It's, oh, what about the ligaments and the cartilage and all the tendons and muscle attachment sites and all those things that are just going to be affected by that. And so I think that could be a really helpful way of looking at this issue as well. I guess in a more positive light too, to frame this issue a little bit differently, and something I'd like to hear your thoughts on as well. Do you think that there's a correlation between someone who is what we might say spiritually healthy and someone who is mentally healthy? And is it exactly a one-to-one correlation, or is there maybe a little bit of gray?
Sure. So there's definitely a correlation, but it's not like a total one-to-one causality for sure. So there's definitely an element where you can be perfectly mentally, psychologically healthy. Well, as much as you can be on Earth these days, right? Um, in a broken state, but you can be mentally and psychologically and emotionally healthy in lots of ways and not be spiritually attuned or spiritually healthy. Um, there are plenty of counselors that do great work that have terrible spiritual lives, right? Or no spiritual life at all, but there's a certain level of work that you can only do if you're healthy. So I'm thinking of someone like Sue Johnson, the one who created the therapy modality that I used. Very healthy woman. No idea where she's at spiritually. She's a fallen away Catholic, but very healthy, very vibrant. She does amazing work as a therapist. On the other hand, but being spiritually healthy can also come with not being mentally healthy, right?
Mm,
Like there are saints that were mentally broken, um,
mm,
very much on the more neurological level and having certain mental deficiencies from birth. Um, but they're saints. That means they had a close relationship with God. And then, but there's still some influence between the two, obviously. And I think I mentioned it before, right? You can have such a deep sense of desolation that you actually fall into depression. You
mhm,
can also be so spiritually happy and healthy with God and with your relationship with God, that it gets you through a lot of damaging instances in your life, right? Things that could be otherwise traumatic.
mm.
So yeah, so spirituality um, can also provide a buffer against lots of different types of mental and emotional woundedness. So
Mhm.
there's lots of interplay there, but it's not a perfect one-to-one causality type thing. There are multiple
Right,
influences on all forms of health.
right.
Mhm.
Right. And yeah, and I think coming from a natural sciences perspective too, we'd recognize that um, having, being physically fit and having good physical health is going to make your spiritual life a little bit easier, right? If you are extremely overweight and you're struggling with sleep and you're struggling with healthy eating, and your energy levels are really low, that can make it difficult to just do something like get up in the morning and pray, right?
Mhm.
Um, and affects your overall quality of life. Conversely, if you're really healthy and you're strong, it's easy, and you're disciplined with your physical routine, then it can be a lot easier. Those can pay spiritual dividends.
Mhm.
But just like as you mentioned with the mental health, I do think there is this reality too, where people that have been very spiritually healthy, right, the saints, have often also been the victim of some pretty intense physical sufferings and illnesses,
Yeah, and
of different
mental,
varieties.
emotional. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So I think that's kind of the tension here, right? Is that you can have this high degree of spiritual health, but maybe lesser degrees of physical and mental health.
Yes, but a surplus in one of those areas can serve as a buffer against the faults of other areas. Yeah.
Hmm.
It's like you're saying, like if you are super like physically healthy, it becomes easier to do certain forms of prayer and to stay focused, right? There's a benefit to that, and that will play into the graces that you receive and your continuing spiritual development, right? On the other hand, you
Yeah.
could see it as a great spiritual fervor will lead you to do more physically healthy things, or push you
Hmm.
through hard physical times.
Right.
So, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think too, something, kind of narrow in our focus a little bit more here and get more specific. I think one area that I really see this in, and obviously this has been a lot of your focus during your studies, is the area of marriage and family. So
Mm-hmm.
obviously this is an aspect of our lives that integrates, should integrate, the entirety of our person, the physical,
Mm-hmm.
psychological, emotional, and the spiritual, right? In an ideal world.
Mm-hmm.
um, and so, I guess, how do you see that playing out? Do you think that um, having a strong marriage and family can be something that is mentally, help for mental health and spiritual health? Is it necessary? And what if you have a poor family structure? How does that influence your ability to have good mental and spiritual health?
Mm-hmm. Sure. So far, actually, our conversation's been very actually very Catholic in some ways, like very individual and focused on the person, right, and all the
Mm,
individual aspects of the person, how those work together as unity. One thing that's very much neglected, at least in how we experience it and how we're taught it, in North America, is the importance of how that's interconnected with community. Um, like this is something that early Christians and Jews would have understood on a very intuitive, deep level, is the importance of community because it was more important to them. Um, and so I think it's very easy for us to think on a hyper individualistic level, even as Catholics these days. Because to
mm,
answer one of your questions, like having healthy communal life, having a healthy family, and growing up in a healthy family is directly correlated to a lot of your individual health and success. Um, so, like the way I see it, and this is something that I really benefit from in my particular counseling theory because we say it's both intrapsychic and interpersonal. In other words,
mm,
it's vertical and it's horizontal. And those two things are connected, and they're connected at the level of emotional attachment, which is kind of it's the mediator of those two things, right? Um, so when it comes to other people being necessary, they're absolutely necessary, and more so than you realize, because when you have someone there to take care of you that you can trust, and you have this growing up, then they share really a lot of their resources with you, um, because your emotions are highly linked to a whole bunch of different health factors for you. And so when you're
mm,
connected with someone, you're able to share, you're able to be safe, you're able to be vulnerable. That frees up a lot of emotional space that you'd otherwise use for coping, in that you know they help you with that, right? And we have mechanisms in our brain that help us decrease stress with other people, and in having that safety and security and receiving love, that frees us up to then explore and to grow and to mature and to learn how to adapt. And when difficult things hit us that are more than we can bear, we can share those with someone else, and it offloads it to a fair
mm,
extent. And that frees up our individual development. And then that in the future, so that makes us an individual, so that then we can engage further in deep relationships with other individuals,
mm,
right? Because then we weren't so bogged down before, and that frees us up to then co-regulate with more people and to help them, right? So in romantic relationships and having kids, especially, which is a family, right? It's a romantic relationship or a conjugal relationship that leads into children. There's lots of this emotional co-regulation going on that frees you up to do more things. And to have a lack
mm,
of that means that all of those resources that you have, physical, mental, spiritual, they're going to go into coping, and that's draining, and eventually it tears people down. And if it's severe enough,
mm,
then that can lead into things like addiction or whatever else, right? Or at least just not even being as productive as you
mm.
could be because you're struggling with this other stuff. So yeah, they're intimately connected. They're connected at the emotional level. Another thing that's, I think, very neglected these days, particularly in the church, right, is the understanding of the emotional health of the person, because sometimes it's relegated just to the passions, and the passions don't always have a good rep, depending on who you talk to. So,
Right.
yeah. Which is not to say that emotions are these inviolable things that are always perfect. They
Hmm.
they have their limits, but they serve a lot of purposes that we need to respect and use properly.
Sure.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's a lot that you shared there. I guess just
I
a
hope
few
that
points on
covered the
that.
question.
Yeah, it was a big question, I guess. Yeah, I think um, pardon me. Yeah, this yeah, so much of what you're saying, it makes a lot of sense. I see Dr. Wallenfang giving you some thumbs up there with the different points. I think you could summarize a lot of this, and both from the psychological side and theological side, is so much of our health is defined in terms of our ability um, to really sustain and initiate and receive and prolong these healthy relationships.
Yep.
Um, Being defined by mutual self-giving and trust and vulnerability, healthy boundaries, those sorts of things. And so I think it's so much of what you said, I think, to me speaks to that, where in on the mental, the natural, psychological level, we would say that someone who's incapable of forming healthy relationships with another person, or has serious impediments to that, is struggling with some sort of disorder in their mental health, right? That they're not quite as they should be. And then on a spiritual level, of course, the two greatest commandments are to love God and to love your neighbor.
hmm
And love implies not just self-gift, but also this idea of relationality.
hmm
And so I think that's for me a very clear sign of where these two ultimately intersect in terms of our ability to function in healthy relationships.
hmm
Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, because when I'm talking about, say, attachment theory or emotional regulation, it is what I'm really talking about is just love, right? Like it's this exchange of love that gives us so many benefits on literally every single level, even down to the most minute biological level for us sometimes. Um, because the fact is, if you're less stressed, then um, you're right, you're less stressed because you have someone there for you. Then your body heals faster because we know that once your um, immune system starts shutting down when you're stressed, like your body doesn't. Sorry,
Mm,
immune system comes online, shuts down. Yeah, shuts down. Right, so you're more likely to get sick. You heal less quickly. Right, scars won't heal as quickly. So it's just like the importance of love for us as human beings is integral at
mm,
every single level of who we are.
mm,
And the benefits we receive from it includes like years on our lifespan, even. You know.
mm.
hmm
Right, right. I think too we have to look at defining that word love. Um, I think in our culture that there's sometimes a tendency to define love exclusively in terms of romantic relationships, the sexual dimension of the human person. But of course, there's many people that experience genuine love that have no sexual relationships in their life, right? You think of children, the elderly, people that are disabled. You know, those are
Yes.
those are all realities.
But it could be any one of those forms of love, right? So it's wherever you
Hmm.
find this safe haven where you can be vulnerable and be yourself.
Hmm.
So in the literature, we talk a lot about like adult relationships or parent-child relationships, but it can just be a good friend. You know, it can
Hmm.
just be that there's a priest or a pastor who gives you enough every so often. That keeps you going.
Hmm.
It can be any manner of human relationship, really.
Right. I
hmm
think that point of friendship too is a really good thing to emphasize, because I think it's been something that has fallen to the wayside both in the church, in our discussions of what is a healthy, integrated, saintly life look like, but also in the culture, which, as I mentioned before, I think places a lot of emphasis on romantic relationships, relationships with the opposite sex, but has tended to at times neglect the more fundamental um, friendship that romance builds upon, and friendship with people, of the same sex, and non-romantic relationships that are friendships. And so, I think that too is something that's worth exploring. And certainly during this time of pandemic, I think people have been feeling the absence of that friendship and community. But maybe just from your own, your studies and something of your own experience too, what do you think the value of friendship might be, especially for people that are struggling with mental health?
I mean, the value of friendship is a lot of the same value that comes from romantic stuff, right? It's the companionship, right? And it can be another place where it's safe to be you, where you can both give and receive in love, right? I don't know if there's any special nuance to it, although I do see, as much as we see like sort of this hyper emphasis on romantic relationships, and sometimes even this idea that you can't really be friends without eventually falling into a relationship with someone of the opposite sex, or something like that. Like, but like I still see some stories told in various forms of media where it's like, but no, this is like about like a group of guys that are close, and they do go on adventures together, and they're able to have this healthy platonic relationship that's really bonding, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking of a video game right now, a more recent one. Um, but it's there. But that story is there, and I see that more. It doesn't come so much from our culture all the time, but other cultures.
Hmm.
Like you'll see it in Japanese culture quite a bit. A higher emphasis on friendship, and platonic friendship too. Maybe here in North American culture, it's more in like sports culture, where
Hmm.
like a team will be close or something, right? Or military culture. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but the average day-to-day stuff is not always as common. That's true,
Mm-hmm.
but it's just
And
as important.
right, right. And what do you think the absence of these day-to-day friendships, what effect does that have maybe on the psychological well-being of the person?
Sure. So it used to be that most people lived in close-knit communities. We're kind of apparently as human beings, we're more oriented to being actually in communities of like 130 people or so. Like that's kind of average village size or something. At least when a major evolutionary gains were being made for us, we're developing. 30 to 130 probably be what you're looking at range wise. So what's happened now though is because our friendships do kind of break down. It's harder for us to have those friendships a lot of times. Like what ends up happening is the burden is kind of placed elsewhere to manage that uh, the emotional burdens that we carry or the different life burdens that we carry. And so with shrinking communities, what ends up happening is all of that pressure ends up being put on the family itself.
Mm,
Um, and there's kind of a problem with always emphasizing the nuclear family too much because while that's the basic building block of society, um, right now there's a lot of pressure. Like there's more pressure on your basic family unit for even on a social level than there ever has been because typically you had either bigger families, so you had a much wider range of people to interact with and to help, to go to and to bond with, as well as closer church communities or village communities or whatever. So like all of that burden used to be more spread out among more people, right? You'd share some of
mm-hmm.
it with the baker, you'd share some of it with your priest, you'd share some of it with the church friends that you'd go out with after mass on Sunday or whatever, right? And you'd have a closer knit sense where you could lean on more people, but now it's becoming hyper focused on your spouse.
Mm,
So I think this is more of a marriage and family thing, but so the loss of friendship, what I'm getting at is that it creates more stress elsewhere. It creates more pressure elsewhere, um,
mm.
and then increases the chance of isolation and more burden on your spouse. Because they have to, by default, take care of more of your emotional needs than before.
Right.
Mm.
Yeah, it reminds me, I don't know the author's name offhand, but there was a book written, I think, within the past 10 years called The Friendless Male American. And it
Mm.
was diagnosing exactly this problem, which is that, particularly among men, there is this absence of strong friendships. and that it was posing some serious strain on especially their marriages, right? Because essentially their wives become, and their children become the only deep emotional connections they have. And so, of course, you want to have good relationships with your spouse and your children, but if that's all you have, and you have the inability to form deeper relationships outside of that immediate nuclear family, then as you're mentioning, I think there's can be some very serious negative effects that come from that.
Yeah. Plus, if you have like hobbies or something, you want like if you want to show someone else, like your wife probably isn't going to care if you're some sword enthusiast. Most wives don't care for your sword enthusiast. Like you need to go and find other people to be a sword enthusiast with.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I guess that's a great point too, is that what ends up happening is you expect these relationships to do everything, right? And so if you have particular interests that you want to explore, particular things that you're gifted at that, your spouse or your children are not, then it becomes like, well, what do I do with these? So that's a great point. I like that a lot. Yeah, I heard you reference it a little bit earlier, and I think it does tie in a lot to our conversation. But if you could just explain for people that are watching, it's something that you've spoken of quite a bit with me, and have mentioned a couple times in this conversation already. But this idea, attachment theory, if you want to maybe elaborate a bit more on that.
Sure. Yes, I did drop that name earlier. Attachment theory started off as a theory of child development. So early attachment theorists were paying attention a lot to mother-child relationships and interactions. To see what works, to see how to raise children better. But it's really evolved over time, especially with the work of English researcher, academic John Bowlby, who really brought this now into like more the adult romantic area, right? Adult love, alongside, of course, the child and parent relationship. And the idea is that for us to thrive as human beings, we need each other. So we need people that are safe havens for us. Technically, you only need one. Okay, so if you're like a single parent and you're able to nail down this attachment stuff, your kid will be perfectly fine. As much as it's easier to, of course, have both parents and all the benefits that come with both parents and love there, you can do it. Your kid can be just fine if you are able to be a safe haven where they can be vulnerable. And then it's from this place of being able to be vulnerable and safe that you end up maturing healthily. And you have what we call a secure attachment style, where you're able to express your needs, you're able to regulate yourself much better. Okay, so the thing about, I talked about coping before, but actually you're able to cope on your own much better if you've had that experience like of healthy, safe attachment, right? So the benefits of this secure attachment I've already gone into, but it's more or less like what you have to do to create that secure attachment is sort of what one analogy is ARE, so accessibility, responsiveness, and engagement. And so we know that parents that are these things to their kids end up being very healthy, being very attached, being very close. They're able to share their emotions. They're able to state their emotions, of course, which is something that not everyone can do, unfortunately, which is, you wouldn't think it'd be a huge issue. But yeah, so a lot of people aren't even aware of what they're feeling a lot. And it's from that base then that you're able to go out and to explore. So like little kids, if they're doing well, right, if they're healthily attached, they'll go out from mom, they'll explore a little bit, they'll look back, make sure mom's still there, and then keep on exploring and then return when they need a little bit more help or to rejuvenate, right? And in lots of ways, like that's what a home ends up being for a married couple, right? Is that's where you go and that's where your spouse is and you rejuvenate with them, and then you're able to go back out into the world. If you want to put a sort of evangelistic tone to this, it's your church then is also a safe attachment place where you go out into the world and you do evangelization and you come back and then you're spiritually rejuvenated through Christ and you grow in your relationship further there and then you go back, there's a sort of like attachment has much broader applications when I really start thinking about it. But basically it's this idea that we grow in relationship with each other. And that's
Right.
what's supposed to happen. It's a reflection of God himself. He made us for that relationship. So,
Right.
mhm.
Right. And of course, I think, again, this is another area where you see a very clear intersection with the spiritual life. And so if you're unable to form proper, healthy attachments in the natural with people around you, then in the supernatural and trying to form a healthy, balanced relationship with God, um,
There's more
obviously
difficult,
it's a little bit,
yes.
yes.
Yes,
I mean,
there's some
obviously there's,
obstacles. Mhm.
you got to nuance that a little bit in terms of what a healthy relationship with God looks like.
Yes,
Um,
but the basic idea of of that security and that vulnerability and being able to grow
mhm,
from that was the same dynamic. Absolutely. But you
mhm,
can also heal it with God. So and some attachment theorists, attachment therapists, or oriented therapists recognize that. So like even my own therapist tried using my relationship with God to create some healing for me. So of course you can do it. Many saints have shown that this is possible. Um,
mhm,
it's just that likely takes a bit longer.
mhm,
Um, unless God's giving like special grace and like special interactions with you, yeah, it takes a little bit longer, to really trust something that you can't trust someone that you can't necessarily hug, before you go to bed at
mhm.
night or doesn't, say hi, honey, when you get home, you know.
Right.
So it's a bit different, but you definitely can get the same effect.
Mm.
Mm.
Yeah, and I think too, I mean, one of the most well-known and fundamental biblical images that we have of God, of course, is God as Father, right? And I think that's one of the best embodiments of what you've been describing so far in terms of a secure and safe space where you can be completely vulnerable and loved unconditionally. And I think the concept of Father, rightly understood, definitely embraces that. So
Mm.
um,
Yes.
yeah, of course, yeah, of course, as an aside, I think our culture is experiencing something of a crisis with fatherhood, and certainly in the US, so many children being raised without fathers. And so I think that might be um, something that, we need to look at a little bit more, and something that the church needs to be able to address and say that, in the absence of earthly fathers, that there is a heavenly Father who has not abandoned us.
Hmm. Yes, and providing the means by which that's easier, right? Easier to
Mm,
understand what is God's fatherhood. Because it's very easy then for us to get caught up on images of hell and judgment, and God's going to strike you down
mm,
for a small misstep. Like there's all that fear too that really needs to be banished before
mm,
people are going to be comfortable with approaching God in a wounded state, right?
right.
Hmm.
Yeah, yeah, and I think too that can also be one of the biggest obstacles for some people if they've had really poor relationships with their earthly fathers. That this idea that God is a father, even if He's the heavenly Father, but that God identifies Himself as Father, can be a source of tension, and
Yeah,
it might make
especially
it
if
more
Father's
difficult.
absent, to then go to an invisible God, right, who can feel
Right.
absent all the time, and then a normal
Mm,
part of the spiritual life is desolation too, and that can hit on attachment wounds. So yeah.
right, right. Desolation, of course, being the experience of God's absence, and being drawn away from God. And anyway, I'm getting into that whole conversation here.
Yeah.
Just want to contextualize some of
The
these terms
feeling
for
that God
people.
has abandoned you. That's the feeling of desolation, that God has abandoned you. And he's
Hmm.
not there for you. Like that's the temptations, that he's not there, he doesn't love you, he doesn't love you sometimes.
Right.
Yeah. Hmm.
I think there's a.
That can be hard.
Hmm.
Like especially if you didn't have a dad growing up, like that could hit on some wounds for you.
Right.
Hmm.
Right. Oh, Dr. Wallenfang is asking, do you have any advice for married couples emerging from the pandemic, especially those couples who grew a lot closer together during the pandemic?
Do they need any help? I mean, if they grew closer during the pandemic, I'd say it could be that one temptation is to become too insular, right? Is so like now if you've improved your relationship with your spouse during this time, that's great. But as with any time of like deep spiritual growth or deep growth in general, like there's a time when now you need to go back out, right? Otherwise, you become insular and it kind of crumbles in on itself, which I
Hmm.
think is an issue that the church is coming out of right now, right? Leading up to Vatican II, very insular. So I'd say if you've disconnected from some friends, like branch out and reconnect with friends. right? Because you still need that, and it's very tempting to want to rely on your spouse for too much, because that's a thing. So I'd say, yeah, reconnect in other ways with other people. Like, keep the relationship, of course, keep the strength and the growth that you've received, but now use all that energy and go out and do other things, because that's what it's for, right? That relationship
Right.
is so that you can go back out and explore and to connect with others.
Right.
So, mhm.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think John Paul II, in his he was the Pope before two popes before Pope Francis, who we have now, but he spoke about this kind of circular motion where we go from, communion into this more mission outward facing, and then we come back to communion. And so I think it's a really you're hitting on a bit of that dynamic as well in
Yeah,
terms
that
of
is the dynamic. That's the
needing
that's
both.
the attachment dynamic. Yeah, you need
Hmm.
both, right?
Hmm. Well, I guess just one thing, and I say briefly, but something to briefly address maybe, and something that might also nuance Dr. Wallenfang's question a little bit more, or provide a different angle on it. Um, a lot of people during this time of pandemic, it's been spiritually very tumultuous. For some people, it's allowed them to grow a lot deeper in their faith. For some people, it's been very challenging. Of course, as Catholics, we recognize that having the churches closed and not having access to the Mass has been really devastating for a lot of us. Um, but I guess the with our human relationships in some instances becoming very intense and very close, um, how do we avoid a competitive mindset between different attachments? So how do we have a strong attachment and relationship with a spouse, or a close friend, and not get in the way of other relationships, right? For example, our relationship with God.
Ah, okay. Um, yes, that can be a thing. I think one thing to explore is maybe first for me, because I don't like dichotomies very much if they don't have to exist, right? So especially when it comes to relationship with your spouse, how does that play into helping your relationship with God, right? But when it comes to sharing human relationships, you just got to figure out what those boundaries are and communicate, right? And set up. Sometimes you do have to set up particular times to do something with friends, right? Like, especially
Mm,
once you get married in general, you have to start scheduling more with your other friends because you need to be available to your spouse. Um, so yeah, I think that's sort of more of a basic boundary setting issue. Um, I don't know if there's too much more to say on that one. Um,
mm,
yeah, but make time, but make sure you do have time for your friends, right? I think, and maybe this is where kind of like similar with loving your spouse, and having that be a means of growing closer to God, and vice versa, your spouse loving you. Maybe one way to look at being with other friends is like you go and be with friends to get what you need to do done with them, so you can be more available for your spouse, right? Have some time for whatever your hobby is every week, and have some time for your friends, so that you're not thinking about them so much when you're with your
mm,
loved one. Yeah.
hmm,
So it's sort of yeah. And that in and of itself is a way of loving your spouse, and of your spouse loving you and encouraging you to go out and do those things that are good for you.
mm.
Hmm.
That's a great point.
Hmm.
Okay, awesome. Dr. Wallenfang has a follow-up question I think is really relevant, and something that maybe as a church that we haven't always done a very good job of addressing. Actually, I'd say we've done a pretty poor job of it in many circles, but he asks, any tips on how to deal with stress and anxiety on a daily basis from a Catholic perspective?
Sure. Um, so of course, there's everything I mentioned before, like just the healthy attachment stuff and um, a healthy relationship with your spouse that manages automatically a lot of that stress and anxiety. Um, Even more so if you're sharing that stuff and they're giving you the empathy and the emotional love and care that you need. Otherwise, um, we know, of course, exercise, a healthy physical life helps decrease stress, automatically because it uh, puts new hormones in you and helps wash out other hormones. Same thing with sleep, similar idea. Prayer helps with anxiety and stress. Um, if there's unnecessary worry about certain things, then that's something you want to bring into prayer. So if you feel like you're too attached to worries about finances or something like that, offering
Mm,
those up and make sure you have a healthy healthy relationship with all these worldly things as a spiritual person, because that can cause undue anxiety. And then a part of that would, of course, be reading scripture and those scripture passages where Jesus is very comforting about not worrying about earthly anxiety so much, because he knows, the Father knows what you need and will provide for you. Same thing with the pandemic. The Father knows what you need spiritually and provide for you even if you don't have Mass. So there's nothing really more I can say about that aside from the usual counselor stuff of sleep, exercise, go out with friends, do something fun every so often. If you're stressed, it's fine to have a piece of chocolate. It can't. If you're super stressed all the time, you can't keep on having chocolate. But chocolate in the short term works. So
Sure.
mm-hmm.
Sure. I think that's a great question. I would just add, yeah, I would just add to that. I think sometimes, as I mentioned before, I think sometimes as Catholics we have difficulty with the idea of mental health, and so a lot of my own experience and of other Catholics I've met is sometimes there's this just two extremes, and it's, again, we don't want to fall into a dichotomy, but there's sometimes an extreme where I've seen individuals that are so focused on their mental health that they think it's essentially their spiritual life is all about just getting their mental health in order. I've also seen the opposite, where people are so concerned about their spiritual lives and not willing or not wanting to integrate the other aspects that they either completely ignore or even react strongly against this idea of mental health and of counseling. So obviously, as a counselor, you have hashtag chocolate or hashtag chocolate. Sorry, Dr. Wallenfang's comment.
Yeah. Truth.
Yes, truth. Yeah. So, obviously, as a counselor, you have a vested interest in that. But what would you say maybe to Catholics that are hesitant to seek mental health, and how can they balance that properly with an understanding of what it means to live the spiritual life well?
I think much of what I said before, right? That we're unities as people. Every part of us affects every other part in some way, right? And we've given a few examples of that. But particularly with mental health, and I'm going to put underneath that, and maybe even above that, actually, sometimes, is the emotional health stuff, is that your emotions are deeply interconnected with your spiritual life. Okay, your emotions are one way that communication right? Emotions, well, they manage all forms of communication between ourselves and within ourselves, and particularly within ourselves, they tell us, like, what's going on, what are we worried about, what are we happy about, and where are we going to find those things. Okay, so when it comes to our mental health, anything that throws off your emotions is going to throw you off spiritually to some extent, because you're going to lose access to some of what your soul is saying to you, if I can put it that way, right? So sometimes there are some interior movements that you're going to miss because you are emotionally distraught, or you are stressed, or you are anxious. Whereas having those things in proper order means that communication is I mean, really, you could compare it to internet connection, right? If it's a choppy connection, you have no idea what you're getting. But if you have a healthy connection, well, you get things nice and clearly, and then you know how to react and to respond, right? So even right now, if we had a crappy connection, it'd be much harder to communicate. But if Avery was my soul, so to speak, and we have this clear connection now, I know what I'm going to get, because the emotional communication, right, the emotional bandwidth is online and it's working. So that's the importance of the mental health, is that it actually frees you up to be more spiritually capable and attuned. Furthermore, maybe more on an intellectual basis for those who are really heady, is that we are unities, and so all these things are, like, there's no necessary dichotomy between these different parts of ourselves. It's actually very, like, really, to put it this way, every heretical movement in the church has been some sort of leaning of one side or to the other too much, and not this integration of two sides that the church is always attempting, right? Which is the beauty of our faith, is that we avoid unnecessary dichotomies like the plague, because the truth is usually oftentimes this intricate paradox between two seemingly opposite points. So
well said in the the vein of Chesterton. I think it's a great summary. I know that we're getting near the hour here. We're just about at the 55-minute mark, which I think is a lot of content, and I don't want to go too much over because then people look at the video and they're scared to watch it
Yeah.
after the fact. But I guess we should just kind of end, not to be blind about it, but the title of the video is does mental health matter, or how much does mental health matter? So if you had to kind of summarize it to someone who doesn't have a lot of experience with any of the literature on mental health, and is just kind of curious about all this, what would you say is the relative importance of all this in the context of our day-to-day lives? Or what should be the importance of it?
Yeah, sure. I'd say that mental health sits at a cross section of so many different parts of ourselves, both interior and exterior and relational. So it's just as important as your physical or your spiritual or your relational health. It's another part of yourself, and you have to take care of it and to manage it and to make sure you're getting what you need, right? And that way you're able to do all the other things you want to do, right? It's just because really it's just a means by which you can go off and do the other fun stuff, the other spiritual stuff, the other evangelistic stuff.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And of course, I think, you think about it, if we recognize that our leg was broken, we wouldn't neglect medical treatment. Or if we, hadn't eaten for 3 days, we wouldn't just be like, it's okay, I'll eat, in 3 days from now.
Mm-hmm.
If our physical health, yeah. Yeah. So, if our physical health is seriously out of line, we seek to reconcile that so that we're able to do the things that we know we ought to do. And of course, I think from everything that you've been saying, that mental health plays very much the same role, perhaps on a deeper level.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay. Oh, well said indeed. There you go. I think, I think that is a good spot to maybe end our conversation. But Jean-Luc, I want to thank you so much for being part of this. And
of course.
Thank you to everyone who watched, and thank you for the comments. I hope that people can maybe watch this recording after the fact and find something helpful or beneficial for them. To put in a little plug, Jean-Luc is going to be starting up a counseling practice. So or joining a counseling practice. I don't know if you're starting your own practice. Yes. No, you're starting your own. But if anyone is in the greater Vancouver area and is looking for a counselor, keep them in mind. So, and Dr. Wallenfang says, thank you so much, Avery and Jean-Luc. This has been a very informative, encouraging, inspiring session. Well, thank you for joining us. We're glad that it was helpful for you. Yeah. So, and thank you again to everyone who's watching this, taking the time. And hopefully lots of content coming in the new year. So we'll have more of these kind of conversations that can be helpful and beneficial for people. All right. Well, we're going to sign off, and hopefully we'll see everyone next time. So thanks again, everyone. I'm going to end the broadcast now.